We're good to go.
Okay, great. So very welcome to tonight's session. I'm very glad to chair tonight's session. My name is Vera Bühlmann. I am from the University of Technology in Vienna. And before I have the pleasure to introduce Ben Woodard, I would like to say a few words about the School of Materialist Research. It is an informal graduate and postgraduate and postdoc level program that offers seminars and workshops that address the materialisms running through the contemporary science, philosophy, art, mathematics, design, architecture, and politics. SMR is an international platform. It is founded by the Center for Philosophical Technologies at Arizona State University, the Institute of Social Sciences and Humanities, Skopje, the Department of Architecture Theory and Philosophy of Technics at Technical University Vienna, which in cooperation with the Critical Inquiry Lab at the Design Academy Eindhoven functions as a global online school combining education, research, and mentorship to advance academic study at the intersection of social sciences and humanities and the STEM sciences. So tonight our guest is Ben Woodard. He is an independent scholar at the moment living in Germany. His work focuses on the relationship between naturalism and idealism during the long 19th century. He recently completed his habilitation, so the Venia Legendi in the German university systems, it's called like that, at Leuphana University on F.H. Bradley and the analytical continental divide in philosophy. He is currently preparing a monograph on the relation of naturalism and formalism in the life sciences. His recent book, Schelling's Naturalism, was published in 2019 by Edinburgh University Press. And tonight, he will be talking about, among other things, Lancelot Hogben, where I was super keen to encounter the name because I just found him as a scholar as well, and I'm very anxious to hear and to learn more. If you're ready, Ben, the floor is yours.
Okay. Yes, thank you for the introduction, and thanks for the invitation, and to Katerina and everyone else who's organized. I've watched several of the videos after the fact as recordings, and yeah, I'm very happy to be part of something like materialism in whatever the sense means. In that sense, I'll just start. I did the typical bad academic thing and changed the title at the last minute. So still about Hogben, largely, but I dropped Utopia, a typical cowardly move, I guess. But I'm still talking about aesthetics and this question of the human, or the sort of like basic human, or the human as a sort of category of biology and the philosophy of biology, and how it's sort of overcoated aesthetically. And so this is work that is coming out of this large project about biology and formalism, spending time looking at eugenics and this post-Darwin period, immediate post-Darwin period. And then this sort of move into contemporary biology means you sort of have to address these issues. And then after I talk about Hogben, I'm going to talk about the work of Sylvia Winter as somebody who is really pushing for a kind of an interrogation of biology and its relationship to culture in a very interesting, important way, I think. So that's the sort of connection there. So Lancelot Hogben, sort of a forgotten champion of a lot of things. He was a zoologist, a statistician, endocrinologist, also linguist historian later in life. He's from the UK, from outside of London. And several things are quite interesting about him. He was a mechanist, materialist, which means that he was interested in the statistical functions and mechanical articulation of biology, population biology, but he was quite left-wing, and many of those figures tended not to be. He was quite left-wing, but he He had Marxist sympathies, but he was not conceptually sympathetic to some of the biologists on that side. I'll talk about that more later. But he's kind of interesting mix that way. And then, yeah, he sort of in his later life did this massive popular books on language, on iconography, on history of science many times, all sorts of things. So very interesting that way. And the reason I came across him was sheerly through sort of brute force research, in the sense that I was trying to find somebody, or looking for people who were practicing biologists in the early 20th century who were anti-eugenicist, and there was not that many as far as I can find. And he's interesting because, of course, there was people against eugenics, but not so much from the field of the sciences. And in part, I think this was because his class background made him more sensitive to the form of eugenics, especially in the UK, which was really about blue blood lineages. And he also wanted to have a sort of leftist response to the right, what he saw as right-wing eugenics. So he thought that there was reasons to do genetics, and that there were reasons that could improve health and things like this, maybe someday, but that there was a lot of political work that had to be done before that would ever become possible. So, the other place where his name is sometimes known, or there's popular articles where he pops up, is that he helped develop the Xenopus, which is this frog, a South African frog. He helped develop it as a model organism, right? So for lab research. And then some students of his, and there's some debate about how much he contributed and how much was his students. This pregnancy test was developed based on this frog, because previously pregnancy tests generally were you injected the sample from the possibly pregnant woman into a small mammal, you waited a few days, and then you killed it and looked inside to see if ovulation was occurring. And of course, Hogben, through his endocrinological work, realized this would work with a frog. And of course, you don't have to kill the frog, right? Within 24 hours, it would start producing eggs. And of course, you could see the eggs, right? Because it's a frog. So you didn't have to cut it open or anything like this. So, and it's still in use as a model organism, this frog. So his name sometimes appears to that extent. But to sort of illustrate how Hogben, how devoted he was, and it's sort of a nice story also, to anti-eugenics and to this political side of his work. One year he went to visit Oslo, and he went to speak out against the Nazi eugenic policies. At the same time, he was going to meet up with his daughter, who was working as an au pair in Stockholm, with some family friends. So they met up, and then they were going to, after the lecture, fly home together. And this happened. So it was 1940, and the Nazis attacked and seized the airport. So Hogben and his daughter Sylvia had to go home the long way. So they went back to Stockholm, translated some texts, raised some money to get a plane ticket to Moscow. Then they took the Trans-Siberian Railroad to Vladivostok, and then took a boat to China, then a boat to Japan, then a boat to the US, then a train across the US. So a 3-hour flight turned into a 3-year trip, the sort of other way around the world. Had to avoid Europe for obvious reasons. So, this is just to say, kind of was a constant of his life was this political activism. He also taught in South Africa for a few years, and he left because he saw the apartheid government solidifying. And his house was known by the other students as Xenopus, after the frog. And he built a hidden room. Underneath his living room so that people could hide if they were on the run. So he was very serious. He let non-white students into his classes, which he wasn't supposed to do, and then he was constantly causing trouble, as they said. And the other place where Hogben's name sometimes shows up is in relationship with the kind of red scientists, as they're often called, in the UK prior to, during, and after World War II. Right, so some of them are better known. The Needhams, pictured on the left, who worked in chemistry and also history of science and technology in China. You have Haldane in the middle there, JBS Haldane, one of the biggest names in population genetics and origin of life theories. And then Tansley at the top, who kind of created socialist socialist ecology as a field. And then Bernal on the bottom there, who's probably the most well-known, arguably, because he wrote several popular books, kind of advocating for Marxist histories of science and this sort of thing. So they were all kind of sympathetic to Marxism to different degrees. Though, interestingly, Hogben was never sympathetic to dialectics. He was sympathetic to the historical aspect and the sort of civilian science aspect, but not so much to anything that looked too philosophical or too much like religion. He had a very low tolerance for anything like religion, which is fair because he was named after a missionary, because that's what he was supposed to be. So he obviously took that a bit personally, I think. Okay, and then so these are three texts which have addressed Hogben to greater or lesser degrees. Haraway's first book, because many of the red scientists, as I mentioned, were eugenicists. They had this sort of interesting mix of Whitehead, some early analytic philosophy, and Marxism, and it's kind of different, interesting combinations. But as I mentioned, Hogben was not so sympathetic to the conceptual side in that sense, more just the political aspect of it and the historical aspect. But so he comes up a bit in Haraway's book on organicism, and then Werski's book in the middle, that's Hogben, second from the left. That's his head. Has a kind of biographical information about Hogben and interviews with him. And then this was published, I think, last year, Foster's book, which is a socialist, history of ecology, deals with Hogben at some length, has some interesting stuff about his political activities. But for the most part, there's not so much discussion of what his theoretical work meant and how the theoretical work and the biological work related to his political work. And so I think part of this is that his emphasis on statistics and was not so much taken up or hasn't been taken up as relevant to his political side, which is or has been, but very, very little. He wrote these two texts on statistical theory because he was concerned about the abuse of statistics and of probabilities in the biology and the biological theories that were coming to popularity in the 1920s and 30s, especially. And in these texts, he kind of provides a kind of genealogy of probability and statistics and the philosophical concepts attached to these different notions. So in that sense, there's parts of statistical theory, the middle book, that are similar or that read sympathetic to Ian Hacking's The Taming of Chance, which if people know a book on statistics, it's often the one that gets cited. But so one thing that Hogben emphasizes is that in statistics, there's these conceptual or kind of methodological biases that come from different fields, which are being applied at different times to biology without accounting for the differences between the biological sciences and other physical sciences. So he does this kind of survey where he kind of goes through some of the different attitudes towards the emergence of statistics and the treatment of probability, and kind of shows the limitations of them conceptually. So Laplace, he says, there's of course a deterministic model in which statistics and probabilities, so especially probabilities, are supposed to measure our degree of ignorance, right? So there's a sense that the universe is, determined. If we don't know something, our ignorance has to do, with it's about our ignorance. It's not about something being, contingent in a more radical sense, right? So a lot of this emerges from discourse about gambling, right? Like, how do I know how ignorant I am? But there's still this deterministic attitude behind this. And of course, Bayes, which people know, and Laplace kind of pushed a sort of different form of it. The kind of Bayesian approach is also one about ignorance, but it's less, or I could say it's more agnostic in some degree about the overall structure of the universe per se, that it's about when and how should we revise the level of our ignorance, right? So it doesn't necessarily go as far as Laplace and say the universe is determined, how ignorant are we of this or that. It's often, in this situation, I'm ignorant of X and Y. How can my ignorance, of this other thing, or my knowledge of this other thing, force me to revise or not revise my assumptions that I have, right? So it's a bit like a wager and a gamble, but it has this articulation of being about judgment. This is how Hogben describes it. He says it's a probability of judgment rather than a probability of a wager. And then on the bottom right, we have Quetelet, who Hogben spends quite a lot of time talking about as the sort of grandfather or father, one could argue, of biometrics in the broadest sense. So Quetelet was a Belgian astronomer who kind of wanted to apply statistical techniques and probabilities from astronomy onto the social body, right? So everything from discovering the frequency of heights, the average of heights, to craniometry, to fingerprinting, every sense of people that could be measured. He wanted to find a way of discovering the frequencies and averages, right? So while there's no sense of of absolutely knowing the overall structure of things, the idea is that the frequencies let you infer, right, a structure, right? And you say this is the average, right? So you're making a claim like the Laplacian claim, but without necessarily making the overt metaphysical claim or physicalist claim about the sort of structure of things, ultimately, whatever that means. And then lastly, Hogben talks about what he calls the statistics of aggregates, which is the statistics of the behavior of a selection of material, right? So this is associated with the work of someone like Boltzmann, right? So that the idea is that you're sort of bracketing out a particular, whether it's a gas cloud or the support beam for a bridge or something. And you want to be able to measure statistically the behavior of the particles inside, right? So you're not really interested in, outside context to an extent. It's really about focusing on, behaviors relative to this aggregate of this particular material, right? So there's a sort of proto-relativity involved in Boltzmann's work. And so, Hogben's point is that all of these have their own philosophical baggage, and when Quetelet's method, it becomes really popular and imported into the biological sciences, some people take it that the authority is actually one of the other kinds, right? So there's this obfuscation that's occurring. And this is a political and ethical decision, right, about how these models are being made transparent or not. So this brings us to the sort of one of the big episodes of Hogben's life was his rivalry with Fisher. And Fisher is still revered. People are more critical of his legacy now. His name was on a building at LSE. It's not anymore. As far as I know, they removed it. But he was like one of the great figures of the modern synthesis and of the biometric approach to biological statistics, right? So he, he's the one who sort of wanted to show how frequencies and averages could essentially justify and articulate not only the Darwinian picture of things in the early 20th century, but also, inform policy and inform and also bolster pre-existing attitudes about class in particular, but also race and these sorts of, traits that were considered, measurable in a sort of statistical way. But to sort of understand the rivalry, you have to have, a kind of some overview of biological theory and some of the big kind of movements of the time and how this plays into that bigger picture. So there's this immediate post-Darwinian picture, which I'm not going to go into the details because it would take much too long, but I'm happy to answer questions. How that there were various approaches after Origin of Species comes out to sort of alter or fight or re-articulate the transformation of species in other terms. Darwin wasn't, I should say, the mechanism of natural selection wasn't accepted broadly in the decades following the Origin of Species, but it was kind of attached to other pre-existing theories. And then slowly, right, it sort of gained a momentum through a kind of combination of functional approaches and some paleontological work, but the sort of typical story that's told, and I'm going to go into more detail with this first bit in the next slide, right, is that this boiled down to an opposition in the early 20th century between the biometricians and the Mendelians, right? And so the sort of short version of this is that the biometricians basically accepted that natural selection was occurring and that this was the engine of evolution. But rather than trying to find the material or causal, specifics of how that occurred, they wanted to show it, right, by measuring population dynamics, right? So the idea is to show that natural selection is occurring because you can say, look, these traits were this prevalent, then they're this prevalent, these ones are dominant, these ones are recessive, right? And then you can retroactively infer that something like natural selection is occurring. Right. But on the other side, around 1900, Mendel's work is rediscovered by several different people around the same time. And they argue that they were interested in the causal mechanisms or the causal forces, in some cases, of not only natural selection, but maybe things that were either stronger or at least in competition with natural selection. And so trying to explain, how do mutations occur within one generation? How do rapid advancements in camouflage occur in moths, or these types of questions? How do certain plants explode in variety so quickly? And they're often seen as anti-Darwinian. And if you go back and look at them, it's actually not the case, but they were sort of made to look even more anti-Darwinian over time. They basically thought the Darwinian picture was incomplete. And you go back and read them, they say this, but they don't generally dismiss Darwin outright. But I'll go into the details of that in the next slide, just to sort of give you the overall picture. Right. I mean, so that's the problem that Hogben and Fisher, that's the generation they sort of came up in. And then in the early 20th century, there's no fixed date for this. You have what's called the modern synthesis, right, where basically this, again, the typical story is that the biometricians take the Mendelian concepts and sort of translate them into their language, right? So you can basically take Mendel's ideas about inheritance and heredity, and you can mathematize them in a much more extrapolative way, right? And basically say, yes, Mendel and Darwin are compatible. But of course, in so doing, you suspend the question of causal dynamics, right? Which also in turn mutes or lessens the importance of environmental qualities, right? That gets put aside in the statistical articulation. So following this, you have the modern synthesis kind of goes along and kind of gains speed. And you have it's seen as like the dominant model by most people at the time, though there's still opposition, for instance, from organicism. This is the thing I mentioned with the red scientists, right? That there were people who were, they didn't want to be mechanists or biometricians. They didn't want to be vitalists, which was seen as a kind of closed off option to most of them, but they wanted to be something in between, right? And they wanted to sort of emphasize environmental factors and to emphasize the role of the organism, right? To understand biology in terms of the behavior and capacities of the organism that they thought was being elided in this increasingly statistical and population dynamics driven account of evolution. And so, I mean, the idea is that this opposition between the more and more biometric account and some opposition continues until today, in just in different forms. So for instance, in the 60s, when you have the sort of molecular revolution and you have this famous, I think it's in 65, right, when Monod and Jacob and Wahler, they win the Nobel Prize for, figuring out how transcription works, right, between enzymes. I think Giuseppe Longo mentioned this in his talk last week or week before here. And so, there's a sense that the molecular account of the genetic picture lends a new authority to the population dynamics image, right? The fact that, okay, we can add a sort of mechanistic, even more fully articulated weight, right, to this statistical and population dynamics. But what's interesting is that Monod and Jacob, they win the prize together, and then 5 years later, they each write a book. And Monod's is much more well known, I think, Chance and Necessity. And Jacob's is called The Logic of Life. And Monod's is a kind of like very optimistic, like, science is going to answer the questions, we're going to make this happen. And Jacob's is like totally the opposite, like Foucauldian genealogical kind of critique. He said he didn't read Foucault, but Foucault liked the book a lot and they talked afterwards. Basically saying we don't know very much yet, actually. We're still stuck in a particular language. We need to break out of this. And so, this opposition is still occurring in some form. And then into the 70s and 80s, and there's some version of this now, right? There's still either opposition or at least tension between this genetic, or gene-centric model of evolution and the more organism level or paleontological or more environmental, right, aspect of this, represented, for instance, in Dawkins versus Gould, or you see it even more recently with the sort of neo-Darwinian or extended evolutionary synthesis ideas, right? The idea that, does Darwinian theory need to be rethought in a structural way or not, right? And so these questions are still continuing now. Okay, but to focus then on this first one, I won't go through all of them in super detail, but just the first one here, the Biometricians versus Mendelians, because this is what matters for Fisher and Hogben. So the typical story is that, right, the Mendelians were treated and still are treated as mutationists, right? That the argument is that they thought that mutations were the only or the primary driving force of evolution. And so this is a way that in history books and biological history texts, they said like that was just wrong, and the biometricians kind of won, and we don't need that anymore. But what this ignores is the fact that the mutationists and the Mendelians, so people like De Vries or William Bateson, for instance, what they argued is that mutations were proof of more complex processes occurring at a level that might be different from the genetic level, right? So that genes had a causal power to some extent. We weren't sure quite how it worked yet, but that there were also what they called noise or variations occurring at a very, very low level, and that's what, evolution was coming out of that, which could be genetic, but also, chromosomal or other things going on with, the sort of chemistry involved in terms of phenotypic development and how variations are passed on or not. And so, but the picture that's told is that, the natural selection, this is why I kind of draw the red arrow, that mutations are sort of opposed to natural selection, when in fact it's kind of a level, sort of a mismatch in terms of explanatory levels. And so what Fisher and his, the other biometricians did was essentially to sort of absorb, right, the noise and variations model, but claimed that this could be measured and understood in terms of talking about idealized populations, right? And Hogben, and therefore anything that was like an outlier was just seen as a sort of like, random error or something kind of outside the average that didn't mean anything really. But Hogben, very importantly, suggested that there was no neutral ground. There was no null hypothesis where you could decide in advance what an measured average or statistical measurement of something meant relative to the organism's relationship to the environment. So the point was that environment not only affects development, but that it affects development in non-linear ways. And there was experiments that had shown this, had proven this already, that if you take, two larvae of the same, species, so you take fruit fly larvae, and you expose one to one temperature and one to a lower temperature, of course, you'll expect the one at the lower temperature to not develop as well. But if Fisher was correct, if the environment didn't matter that much, you would expect the rates to correlate, right? That the two lines of growth would mirror each other. But of course, that's not what happened, right? You would get very crooked, complex, nonlinear things happening, and that development would take many unpredicted stages relative to environmental change. So the point of this was that, Hogben's point was it's even hard to say what is environment doing, even if the really simplified environment at different times. He says, you can't just assume that all this variation is just a kind of deviance from a norm, because how do you know what a norm is if such a tiny environmental change can make such a huge difference that is not linear, right? So, Hogben and his sort of work was left to the side. Gillian Huxley's book kind of names the modern synthesis. Organisms become mostly carriers of genes, right? The kind of Dawkins picture. But as I mentioned more recently, there's been rediscovery of early epigenetics work, especially by LeBlanca and others who have looked at the work of Waddington. Waddington was also one of these Marxist thinkers in the UK, who kind of is the grandfather of epigenetics, understanding how these environmental changes occur and how genetic flow is, has to be sort of spatialized in a certain way to understand niches. There's starting to be more research on this evolutionary synthesis, the extended synthesis, and how this relates to humans. And if you want to know more about that, you can ask me in the questions. That's why I put the picture of Audrey Hepburn with some tulips. So if you want to know what that is there for, that's, to remind me and you. Okay, so, so why does this matter in terms of, being something other than a historical endeavor? And one of the biggest reasons is that, so biometric model and some of the biases have been so baked in to the theories that it's kind of lending itself to a new wave of scientific racism. And, so this has to do with, understanding biology as this kind of passive mechanism, which we merely measure, even though the history of biology had this tension between this kind of more active, right, organism level, self-modification, mutation, autopoietic, right, all these types of themes, this kind of active mechanism, as Jessica Riskin calls it in her book, versus this kind of passive mechanism, right, the fact that, well, we don't really know what's going on, so we just measure it, right, statistically, right? So this allows, as Riskin points out in her history, this allows for a kind of political and methodological agnosticism to an extent, which is very dangerous. And the sort of, next example of this kind of, problem is that Jonathan Marks, people might know this book, he wrote this book in the, I think, early 90s, if I remember, or maybe it's a bit older. where he kind of critiques all the racist uses and misuses of race as a biological concept. And the phrase human biodiversity was taken up and now is a alt-right term, right? So they took the term from him and made it into the exact opposite of what he wanted to do. And this is how this happened, and the details of this are talked about in Sani's book, which is the last one here, which is about the return of race science. And people don't believe me how bad it is, but the fact is that in the last 2 years, the amount of racist scientific papers that have managed to get into mainstream publications has increased hugely. And they don't look like it. And this is part of Hogben's legacy, was, this veil of numbers, where if you don't know, the concepts behind them, it looks really neutral and it looks very professional. And there's people who are doing open source, it's not just fringe, and it's not just fringe publications, it's major publications in evolutionary psychology and sociology. And I can send you, if people are interested, there's an article that came out very recently, which is actually a survey of how this occurred. Right, so it's a contemporary problem, and this is why I was working on something unrelated and reading the work of Sylvia Winter, and I had no idea that she was so interested and so had such an in-depth analysis of what it means to sort of see humans as biological first after the fact, right? So this idea that humans are biological and then culture is stuck on top, right? How, she shows how pervasive this idea is, and how problematic it is for this kind of social biology used as like supposedly politically neutral. So Winter has gotten very popular in the last couple of years. She's kind of been taken up in this wave of emphasis on decolonialism, but she's been writing since the 60s. So she's been writing and working for a long, long time. And she has done dramas and a novel, but mostly she's produced huge amounts of critical work, which is a mix of, as it says, colonial history, Black radical thought. She addresses neuroscience in detail, economics, literature, Marxism, and it's quite amazing reading her, because I think many of us are probably used to seeing certain scientific concepts picked up and maybe addressed sort of in passing, by continental theory in various ways. But Winter, is always like on top of the newest stuff, and she's incredibly interested in like, what does this mean? Like, really, what does this mean? And so that's what makes her, one of the many things that makes her such an impressive thinker, and so important for thinking about how biology is treated, as producing truth or not. So, like I said, she's like 50 years of work. I can't really hope to explain it all, but I hope to sort of show some of the most important aspects of it, and then why, it relates to this question of the biocultural. So in her early work, she has a kind of critique of Marxist political economy, which there's been a lot written about recently, right? That in some of Engels' work and also in Marx, there is this equation between, the slave and the serf, right? That the dispossession of the serf's land is the labor conditions make them similar enough. And of course, Winter and others have shown how, the plantation model of labor is not labor in the same sense, especially when your own body can be dispossessed, and your future generations, if you're an enslaved woman, right, can also be sold as a commodity. And so the idea is that history, that colonial history, has a very different articulation of what labor means. And that while Marx and the Marxists kind of note it doesn't really have the fundamental weight that she thinks it should. And so, the other story she tells in terms of like how the West became, the stand-in for the human, basically, And she also kind of engages with a lot of deconstructions approaches to literary theory, but with the idea in mind that this discipline of aesthetics, or the discipline of the novel, fundamentally is a sort of a defense of what she sees as bourgeois individualism, right? Which again is made possible through, the comforts allowed, by colonial enterprises, right? So this kind of raising up of a certain personal private consciousness comes out of this material exchanges overseas. And she engages quite a bit with Foucault in Foucault's work, and sort of pushes this genealogical method beyond this sort of Eurocentrism of Foucault. And she talks about, and this is one of the most fundamental aspects of her work, she talks about the overdetermination of man, right? So she says, we've never had the human, we've never really talked about the human in a proper, like, global sense, but that, there was a sort of Christian moral cosmological man one, she calls it, right? The sort of figure of that displaced the human, up, through the Renaissance and a bit beyond. And then that switches at some point to this kind of what she calls biocentric or economic model of the human, right? So this is the sort of Adam Smith social Darwinian kind of model of the human, or sorry, posing as the human, but actually being man, again, just in different terms. And, so this is where she appeals not only to decolonial thought, but also, again, intensely to biology and to the legacy of Darwinism, but also extensively to neurophysiology. So, her argument is essentially that, Western Europe has produced a myth of itself that feels good, right? And that, this is built upon some very deep-rooted physiological aspects of human beings, namely the kind of, the sort of neurological feedback and reward systems that led early humans to produce myths and stories, right? Produced certain forms of myths and stories that convinced themselves that they were, superior in some sense. And she relates this kind of neural Darwinianism. She engages with these texts and sort of extended evolutionary synthesis texts, which she was already reading in the 80s, and relates it to the work of someone like Fanon, right, who will talk about, in a philosophical, but also, right, with his psychiatric background, what it means to be slandered, racially slandered on a train, right, that we can't say this is just a social phenomenon, right, that this does things to your mind, right, this does things to your brain, right, and that this idea that, you can't just see the social and the social dynamics of human beings as something stuck on top, right, when the myths of some social groups, right, can have these effects on others, right? So she's saying, this physiological reality is not simply a kind of, it cannot be isolated in any easy sense. Yeah, it's a bit of a joke slide, of course, the picture, but that this then relates to the idea that, humans, for Winter, humans are ultimately what she calls Homo neurons, right? Humans are ultimately storytelling animals that, generate these normative systems or forms of life. And then she says the whole difficulty, or one of the big difficulties for her work, is that it's not just like that we have myths, that come and go, but that we have different cultural groups have myths that persist and that we defend to the death, right? And she addresses this through this articulation of autopoiesis, right? This writing oneself into existence, right? She says, this allows us to believe, right, that these sociogenic factors have, always been the case or are the case for everyone, right? And so this again feeds into this physiological, reward system loop, right? That this myth sort of persists and sustains us in different ways. So, how this relates to the Hogben material, I mean, hopefully it's becoming clear, or somewhat clear. But I think that one thing I really love about Winter's work is that it proves as like wonderful corrective to this shit, if I can put it, it like shows it shows how flawed and limited these types of deep histories are. I sort of love the idea of deep history, but when the deep histories simply accept, yes, wonderful, rational Western people, look at what we did. And they don't, think about the cost of that, or think about like, well, is this just a self-fulfilling prophecy, since who are you writing this, So I think Winter's kind of reward system critique of these types of, the myth of the Western man, it really shows to what lengths they will co-opt other narratives, right, in order to simply reinforce the same story over and over again. And so this is this kind of historical autopoiesis that she sees that's at work under this guise of scientific authority. So it's also important to mention that her interest in the sciences and the biological sciences gets her critiqued from leftist thinkers. And also she gets critiqued by post-humanists for being too anthrocentric. But of course, I think, the anthrocentric critique misses the point, since her whole point is that we've never been human, right? We've never had this thing called the human that you were trying to be post. Like, who is the we that can claim to be post-human, right? And again, she's not saying this because she's disregarding the materiality of evolution or any of these things. She's just simply saying, stories have real effects on, the kinds of life that are allowed, and, so the human has never really existed. And the scientific claim, again, I think it sort of misses the fact that the authority of the sciences has to be, pushed from this like fake neutral position that it sometimes occupies. Otherwise, you sort of just accede, the floor to the, Dawkins and Steven Pinkers of the world, which I think is a dangerous thing to do, and I think that's sort of part of her point. And so, part of the way that Winter talks about this is she says, that the aesthetics, right, and ethics are deeply bound in this sense, right? There is no aesthetics in a general sense, as the Western canon would say, but rather, representations which cause these feedbacks, which then get, entrenched in ethical moral systems. And so the whole point is, you have to create counter representations that just aren't about, surface level equality, but that are about questioning, right, the very road by which you got there, right, conceptually. So this is the genealogical, right, and post-Marxist side. And, the other aspect of this too is, and for anyone who sort of is abreast of what the kinds of claims alt-right makes, right, this sort of idea of whiteness, right, becomes an increasingly strange construction. And there's been quite a lot of work done recently by medieval scholars. And this is, for instance, some images by Madeleine Cavaness. So if you look at depending on your screen settings, the picture on the left and the picture on the right, there's only 40 years between them. But that once the Crusades begin, white people become white, like they were pink before. And then suddenly, once you have Holy War, they start to become white. So this is the same artist, the same family, 40 years difference. And there's literally this divinification of white flesh rapidly occurs. And this is just to say, and part of Winter's point about these myths, right, in the myth construction, in terms of a reward system, right, it's pretty clear when you look at this period in history, how there'll be papal decrees, in the early Crusades saying, well, killing a person with dark skin isn't murder because they're evil. So it's not homicide, it's malicide. It's the destruction of evil. It's not murder. Okay. Right, so they find an aesthetic loophole for the holy soldiers marching off to the Holy Land. So the fact that this kind of aesthetic overcoding is so deeply entrenched, is part of the point, right? The point that like those categories carry forward all the way to the present still. And so they're incredibly persistent myths. Okay, and then so this is, the last slide. So, as I said, it sort of led to this combination. Looking at Hogben and looking at Winter was sort of unintentional, but I think there is a sort of real crisis in the sense that, you need this sort of construction of counter narratives that Winter suggests, and that you also need a sort of, citizen science is a bit of an outdated term and maybe not the correct one, but it's very clear that, for instance, on the right, there's a lot of concerted effort to do this kind of open source science. And I see it on the left, but it seems much more, or much less organized. Maybe that's wrong. I hope I'm wrong. But there is a kind of, there does seem to be a sort of need, I think, for this more overtly social conscious science. Because if the supposed neutrality of the biological sciences is actually center right, then of course papers are going to be published, because they have been in the last 2 years. I can send them to you, right? So to push, things the other direction requires, I think, a kind of overt effort. As as scary as that is to people who have memories of the Cold War and what that means in terms of that legacy. But I think also there's this emphasis when critiquing the biological sciences or the history of biology, that there's, a sort of contemporary emphasis on ontological plurality as something that can be used in place of a kind of genealogy of praxis, or a sort of historical approach of techniques and technologies. And again, I think it's to Winter's credit that she really emphasizes praxis. Right? She's really saying, like, when she does genealogical critiques, right, her point isn't just to knock something down for fun. It's like, what is this thing doing? Right? It's a genealogy in the sense of, you have to look at the actual effects on the ground of these stories, right? Whether it's neurophysiologically or, socially in a more expanded sense, right? That, the praxis isn't like this thing that comes after theory, right? Or this thing that's separate from theory in this way. This isn't helpful. And, sort of last point, the fact that she says human beings are, bio-symbolic or meta-biological, right? That they, is a sort of point that, as far back as we can go, as far back as we find the traces, right? Humans are going to be sort of always already a kind of symbolic entity. And so the case, part of the challenge is to say, how do we talk about the things, the biological aspects, like the reward system, or, the capacities of early hominids to produce culture, right? How do we sort of create that story, that sort of deep history, in a way that doesn't always already, reassert a certain model of rationality backwards in time, right? Or a certain cultural teleology backwards in time. Like, how do we really actually do a deep history that's a properly global deep history, And so this is why, for her, the sort of nature culture aspect of some thinkers, she thinks isn't really sufficient, right? The sort of hyphenization of nature culture. She's like, no, she's actually willing to say, some biological work sort of is going to look like the first steps to us. But the question is to immediately see how early, right, the biocultural emerges, again, without inflating it with an already existing story, right, about rationality, about, whatever. So that's the image credits. And yeah, that's all I have to say. Hopefully it was not total nonsense. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ben. I found this was absolutely fantastic. I greatly appreciate the scope of pursuing these things in a big picture, and also the daring to do so. It's great. We have time for questions. You're all very welcome to send questions in the chat or just raise your hand if you would like to speak. Yeah, so if Katarina always has the nice saying that, of course, we need time to think and make up the questions. So I have one with which we can perhaps start. It's actually just a question to invite you to elaborate a little, because I'm not familiar really with the term extended evolutionary synthesis. And I would be very curious what that actually entails and who would, so could you elaborate a little on that?
Yeah, no, yeah, I should have gone, more into that. So it's the term, I'm trying to remember when exactly the term started being used, but it definitely came about, at least started being popular, I think at least in the 90s, if not a bit earlier. But there's a paper which I can send, but you can also probably find it. It's a four-page paper that's called "Does Darwinian Theory Need a, or sorry, Does Evolutionary Theory Need a Rethink?" And so it's a pro and con, and so that will give you a really condensed picture of the pro position, like yes, it needs to be rethought. Is by, I think it's written by a group of people. Pagalucci is one of the figures that I know. Some of the people who kind of followed Gould are in this to various degrees. So like Lewooten and some of his students. The thing, it's funny, like I actually struggle to find the names because they're much less well known by a singular name. Whenever they write stuff, it's usually in like a group of like 6 or something. Mm-hmm. There's a group there's a really interesting group in Germany at the University of Bochum, which is it's called the Return of the Organism group. So it's Roto-Rub, I think is their name. But what it entails in terms of research is that they emphasize, again, it's this kind of taking this legacy from epigenetics and environmental factors. They basically emphasize the kind of molecular picture of things on the one hand, so that that transcription isn't as direct as we thought it was. And I think a lot of this stuff also gained popularity after, there was this moment of the Human Genome Project where they said, we're going to find this many genes because humans are so complex. And it was like a third or something of what they expected, right? It was like the difference between us and, anything else was much smaller. And so that also fed into this research about, okay, then where do all the differences come from? And so that's, we have people doing research on like niche construction, right, is one, like how do organisms, right, create a sort of environment, right, that affects or accelerates certain aspects of their development, right? You had the various work on, a lot of this stuff comes from molecular biology, where they talk about kind of toolkit genes. Again, you probably have heard of this stuff, right, where they say there's this, a set of genes that produce the same organ, for instance, in totally different animals, right? So that you have, genes that are multifunctional, right, in a way that they didn't expect. And so that also feeds into this picture. But yeah, it's, yeah, I mean, the paper I mentioned is probably a good place to start because they kind of list all the stuff that's important to them. And then the response of the more neo-Darwinians is like, oh, we've already talked about that. Like that stuff doesn't really matter as much. And so this is where the fight is. It's like, how much role did these, sort of medium level, right, in terms of how organisms actually move or migrate, or that, how does this, our sort of macro level behaviors, how much does that actually affect genetic flows? So that's sort of where a lot of this stuff comes from.
Is there a relation, do they make relations to, because Monod has this very strong claim which has not been picked up, so he's always interpreted for almost the opposite of what he actually said, no? So he was all about necessity arising out of contingency. So yes, there was a teleonomy, but it was not a determinism. It was fully accommodative, at least to a large degree accommodative to this interest in that the transcription is not such a direct kind of thing. Are they picking this up, or?
Not as far as I know, and I think I mean, of course, the closest thing I can think of is that there's people who I think tend to be on the neo-Darwinian side, but that also emphasize, right, convergent evolution, right? So if you know this stuff, right, the people who say it's less random than or less contingent than we thought, right? There is something like a teleology, but it's a teleology like we're, within biological life, and so I forget the guy's name. There's a famous guy. Anyways, I think they're the ones who are closest to that, to picking up that aspect. But I don't know of anybody. I mean, the other problem is a lot of the history of biology stuff, at least that I've read in English, it's pretty unaware of anything French. Like other than like the really obvious thing. I mean, like his name will pop up, but yeah, it's quite a hard divide historically between the French world of biology and everywhere else, but especially the English, I would say, and the French, which makes it harder.
Good. We have one votum now. Sena Yitberek. I'm sorry for the pronunciation.
Oh, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes. Well.
Okay, great. Sorry, my video doesn't start, but I just want to say I appreciate that you highlighted Lancelot Hogben's work. I feel that his work is forgotten for many reasons, both as a biologist, but also as a popularizer of science. I was sort of interested in what your thoughts were about some of his motivations around the genotype environment interactions, because I mean, I know he was influenced by Wallace, who also contributed to the theory of evolution, but he certainly was also a developmental biologist, and I wonder if if you compare the developmental biologist with the population geneticist, whether that's sort of those two different strands of background, whether that perhaps influenced or gave him insights into this sort of nonlinear interaction. So yeah, just some of your thoughts around sort of his motivation, or whether it was perhaps political. He was also influenced by the politics of the 30s.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, the idea that he's doing the work on zoology and developmental biology, yeah, I mean, of course, that put him right on the sort of side of things that was going to be skeptical of the degree to which the population genetics model could explain, development, right? I mean, so the emphasis on the environment, of course, came out of that, right? That development involves this kind of time series and these effects from the environment. Which you can't really use the sort of measurements of norms to say, what normal development is, right? And it has a long history, right? In terms of saying, I mean, even it shows up in Kunkiam and like people like this who say like, you can't say there's normal development, right? That's like, and of course, like you're right. I think one of the first things he wrote was about Wallace. And then, I mean, he was a pretty restless thing. He's sort of moving around all the time and shifting fields. But I think for him, this emphasis on development and on the level of the organism, I think, continues through all the way to, to the sort of end of his life. But it is hard, I think, to separate, his political and sort of social background, of course, from why he thought this was so important. Because, for instance, there were people that said, he was quite poor and, he educated himself at the library and got a scholarship, right? And most of the other red scientists, didn't have to worry about money. And there was even people who said, the kind of people who would support Fisher's work were also the people that would say those types of scholarships shouldn't exist, right? Because those poor people can never be as smart as us anyways. So he obviously took that personally. But he tried to, he's interesting. He always tried to make a separation between public and private in terms of his beliefs, because he wrote, he was a pacifist and was always, quite relatively polite in public. But for instance, when he was in South Africa, he wrote poems about how beautiful would all these towers and cranes in Cape Town look if they were all, decorated with hanging millionaires.
Mm.
Like pretty intense, intense stuff. But it's like, well, he was seeing apartheid, the beginning of apartheid. So he was pretty pissed off about that. But I think the thing that kind of falls in between this in terms of development, what that means, and then, social justice in what he was seeing, right? He was seeing, right? Eugenics was not, eugenics was everywhere in the 20s and 30s. It was part of like most nation building projects at the time, right? Post World War I and even before. It was just all over the place. So to me, it's almost surprising that there's so few people that were as outspoken, that didn't sort of see this as bad science and also as sort of morally suspicious, to put it lightly. Yeah, I don't know if that really answers the question, but
yeah, no, it does. And I would also just add that this is usually not highlighted enough, I think, but his wife, partner, Anna Charles, who was a statistician, I think also probably played a very important role. Yes, demographer. Yes. In some of his thinking.
Yeah. I mean, I think they met in the Fabian Society, I think, and then they like took it over and made it a socialist society, right? They sort of like swung it to the left and then, fell in love, which is quite cute. But yeah, she was a very important, did population models. Yeah. He was sort of, everyone said like, oh, he gets so mad when people call her Mrs. Hogben, like, what's the problem? And he'd always like scream at people at parties and say like, do not call her Mrs. Hogben, her name is Charles. But yeah, I mean, she was a big influence on that as well. So I think it's, he was sort of running from this conservative, he had this kind of class identification. He was running from conservative religion, and he fell into this like, incredibly left and radical feminist, context, luckily for him. And yeah, that's.
If I may ask you a quick follow-up, and then I'll shut up. But what do you think Lancelot Hogben would think of sort of dialectical materialism, Marxist dialectics today? Do you think he fell into, because it's quite difficult to categorize him politically. He talked about scientific humanism, and he was also very critical of JBS Haldane, who was a Marxist scientist. So just your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, he sort of identified as a socialist originally, and then and then a scientific humanist later in life, which is a term that Bernal also used. But on the one hand, from what I've read of his own accounts and stuff, he was more suspicious of buying wholesale Marxist ideology, partially because of his hostility towards religion. Weirdly, because I know the Needhams, I think especially Joseph Needham, and I think Bernal to an extent, basically said, this can replace religion in our lives. And there was quite a bit of this, and this has a kind of interesting, like, transhumanist kind of like Marxist, towards the end of time kind of aspect, which you see in Haldane a bit, and this whole Promethean spirit, right? And so on the one hand, Hogben was immediately suspicious of that. He was like, no way, like, get that away from me. But then there's other various accounts where he, like I said, he didn't like dialectics because he thought it was too abstract. He thought that what he took from Marx, even much later in life when he wrote about Marx, he said Marx has been mistreated, but as a historian of the social emergence of technology, or he says science is just the collective labor of humanity. That's what it is, So he sticks to that. So I think, he would be on board with some of the more kind of I would say like pragmatic or kind of ground up technological models of Marxism, but yeah, anything that looked like ideology or anything that looked like kind of state apparatus, he was not inspired by that, and he was also very skeptical about the sort of techno. What did he call it? He calls it like, or kind of industrial romanticism of people like Haldane and Bernal, like that we will use chemistry to transform our lives and it will be like the Jetsons, basically, you know, and we'll have like pills as food. And he was like, no, thank you. I don't want that life, which makes him look almost like kind of communitarian sort of thinker. But he still maintains this kind of importance of the role of science. So yeah, he is really, I think it's part of why he gets less time, like in Foster's book, a bit more in Mirsky's book, but yeah, because he doesn't really fit, you know, he doesn't fit the red scientist model exactly. He doesn't fit the Marxist model exactly. He's kind of straddling them. And he's also claimed that when he did the Trans-Siberian Railroad trip, that he also felt that some of his suspicions about the USSR were confirmed. So whether or not that's true or that's just a convenient fiction, I don't know. But...
Thank you.
Katerina.
Wait, let me unmute myself. Okay, so following up on the previous question, it kind of makes sense to me why Hogben would present himself as a Marxian scientist historicist rather than dialectician. We had two seminars actually in the framework of this school where we tried, me and Reed Kotlas, tried to explain that Marx is not quite the Hegelian dialectician we are used to, you know, hearing about post-Lenin, I would say. You know, this from Lenin on, I think the canon kind of established him as a dialectician in the Hegelian sense, strictly speaking. Hegel does resort, Marx does resort to dialectical methodology, but I've noticed that he uses dialectics in plural or mention Hegel in among other dialecticians as one of the great dialecticians, etc. So Hegel has his own version of dialectics, and that version does resemble theology and teleology, and that's why Hegel, in his humanist phase, wrote this critique of Hegel's philosophy. Marx wrote this critique of Hegel's philosophy in general, and we find similar criticisms throughout his work. So the emphasis is indeed on history rather than dialectics as perceived by and as used philosophically by Hegel. So I find this this interesting, actually telling that all those Marxists that one counts into the category of you know, of orthodox Marxism. Let's also clarify that difference. When one says orthodox Marxism nowadays, one means usually, you know, the canon or the dogma or the doctrine that follows the canonization of things carried out by Lenin. Technically speaking, orthodox Marxism is the one that Kautsky, Rosa Luxemburg, and the others tried to preserve, and that one was more historical than dialectical in the Hegelian sense. So one of the rare examples of later Marxism that remained faithful to this reading of Marx as, you know, his original doctrine was preferred by Alfred's own Rätsel. So, you know, these similarities and closeness, which kind of make sense why and how come he chose the position he did and insisted that that was the scientific position, because Marx also insisted that that was the scientific position, precisely because it moved away from Hegel. So it's more like a conversation than a question. This remark. My question to you, Ben, would be because this was too technical and it required certain level of expertise that I don't have. How do you translate his biological methodology, let's say approach to biology, his version of biology into underpinning philosophical system, if there is any, and set of political values? How do we read him is it possible to read him in that sense? And how would you read him in that way?
You mean Hogben?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, I keep making slips all the time. I say Hegel when I mean Marx, etc., etc. I have no idea what I said. I meant Hogben.
Yeah, I mean, I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what his philosophical sort of root is, and it almost seems like he's very suspicious of any type of abstraction, anything that even looks, he thinks abstract modeling is Platonic in a very bad abstract sense. So he's super suspicious of anything that looks like abstraction, which is sort of why I think he sees Marx in that way, or even if his exposure to Marx, of course, is through this famous this scientific congress, where this they sent this group to London, and they were all kind of shocked by this talking about Newton as like a historical figure, like what does this mean, and this kind of thing. So when I've kind of going through his stuff, Hogben shows some sympathy to a kind of almost like, it's a weird kind of like pragmatic experimentalism or something. So he says things that sound vaguely like Wittgenstein at times. He cites he cites Ryle at one point, saying, I could be a behaviorist of that type, which I think there's something kind of, it was a bit funny to me, because he also, when he talks about utopianism, which I was going to talk about originally, and it was too much of a leap, I think, is that I actually was thinking of like Zonrethel and this type of reading, because it seems like, Hogben kind of has this fantasy of like radically transforming the landscape so that you can have something that looks like communitarian, like agrarianism, but it actually isn't. Right? So like aesthetically, it looks like going back to the land, but really we don't want that. So there's a kind of strange political moment there at the end of his life when he kind of hides in a cottage in Wales. But yeah, to me, it seems like it's a pragmatism, I think, because he's just so against every time, he calls statisticians Platonists, he's like, anything that's abstraction is just like, no, bullshit. If he says, if you can't do an experiment to show, this complexity, then like, don't, give me your crap about, blue bloods and shit like this. Like, that's just baloney. I don't believe it. So it's really about, proof. So I think this is why he's really, I think sort of some weird mix of like late Wittgenstein and kind of this sort of Ryleyan, like skeptical kind of approach to the history of the sciences, which again, he likes this, this historical, he says, science is just collective labor of human beings. That's all it is. But yeah, so there's, I mean, as far as I've read, I cannot find any other, he's just against metaphysics of any kind. He's against any kind of ontological claims. He just rejects them outright. At least every time I've seen this happen. Yeah. So yeah, it's not a very satisfying answer. But yeah, I think it's interesting that it kind of sets him apart from the other ones.
It is. It does say a lot. Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Can I make a comment? Can I make a comment to this? Because I think with Son Ritter, the link is very close. No? With Son Ritter, there is this strong emphasis on intellectual labor, something like an intellectual labor. It's not epistemology, it's not a school or something like that. And what I so much appreciate in Hogben is that he treats mathematics like this. So I would never, in my opinion, he loves abstraction, no, but not the classifying one. But he treats mathematics like you were elaborating about the deep understanding of how a topic comes to be a fact. So he wrote these books like Mathematics for a Million. It makes the whole, it's not the history of mathematics, it's the development of the abstractions almost as if it were an ecosystem. And in the science, citizen science, he has the same emphasis. He starts with how geometry came into being through measurement with the sun clock, but not in a pragmatist kind of, not in a flat way at all, in a hugely abstract and capacious way. And I think the intellectual labor really is a link between, I think, what you are asking for, Katharina, and what you were elaborating.
Yeah, and
that's very interesting. Yeah.
And I don't mean pragmatism in a kind of flat sense. Like I think, and this is sort of why I think him and Winter actually go together quite well, because she's also a pragmatist. She cites Wittgenstein explicitly, but the whole point is, it's pragmatism in the sense that the things we call abstraction, right, are just this kind of, right, it's this concretion of all these acts, right, of all these capacities for action that we discovered and fed back on themselves and then slowly built up, right? So. Of course, you're right. Like he is interested in these abstract capacities, but I think he's pragmatic, or this is why he also likes Ryle, right? He doesn't want to appeal to any secret capacity in the head, right? He's like, abstractions are fine if you can show me how you make them, right? It's like, don't tell me it's the power of reason, or don't tell me it's imagination or something. Like just show me the steps. Because. He even referred to his own thought briefly as publicism, right? So he said, right, like, and this makes sense why he wrote these books that you mentioned, right? Because his whole point was like, because it's also obviously a Marxist spirit to the fact of like letting people understand, right? That anyone can understand how this stuff works, because and it shouldn't cloud itself in. So so abstractions in the bad sense of like not showing your work, and of course he wanted everyone to sort of show their work. So that's what I mean by pragmatic. Though he becomes really obsessed with language later on, which is kind of a funny connection.
Okay, great. I'm glad to hear that. Sena, you have another question?
Yeah. Sorry, this is a very interesting discussion here. Yes. So, and kind of going off the last question, last couple of questions. So I first heard of Lancelot Hogben actually by a reference from Noam Chomsky, because he referred to that book, Mathematics for the Million, and sort of his interpretation, which I think I actually agree with, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on it, is that books like Mathematics for the Million and Science for the Citizen and a whole host of other popular books that Hogben wrote were actually as sort of tools of intellectual self-defense. So if you want to fight the rulers of the world, you got to know some calculus, and you gotta understand how language works, because he also wrote books on that. And I haven't quite seen anybody like that, because as you read through Mathematics for the Million, it's fascinating, sort of historical linkages and how he builds up ideas historically and step by step. But it's also, in a way, for it's also written for the working classes, in that you don't always see these very sort of highly intellectually theorized books, which only very few people can understand, you know? And so I'd like to hear your thoughts about that approach within the left.
Yeah, I mean, it's true. Like this sort of, I mean, I think there's seriously lacking. Again, it's this sort of problem of popular science, right? Where popular science has kind of now especially adopts the sort of supposedly politically neutral stance on the one hand, which is a bit of a problem. And of course, they're written to be entertaining, right? They're not written to be, like, I think, as you put it, like self-defense manuals, which is definitely true. And, you know, I think Hogben had a real talent of, he would play with this like grand story style, right? So the kind of stuff you would read nowadays in these deep histories of, like, you know, the rise of Western civilization. So he would sort of do these kinds of stories, whether he's talking about math or whatever, but then he kind of undercuts them. He'll undercut them with a little like comment, or he'll do a little kind of like dig, which, you know, has the effect, I think, rhetorically of being like, hey, I know this is a bit like grandiose, but like, this is why it's useful. Like, he does these little moments like this that I think are super interesting. And I mean, I was going to mention this sort of as an afterword, but one of the last things he did in his life, he served as, I think, like vice chancellor, or he had some kind of perfunctory sort of title at the first university of Guyana when it became independent. He was asked by sort of Marxist premier Chidi Janga to come and like be part of this socialist university. And so he gives the speech, you know, he gives the commemoration speech in '63. And he sort of says, Western civilization, but, you know, really it was a good thing the Muslims came and gave us real mathematics, you know. And, you know, the Greeks were so great, but they really fucked up with Alexandria, you know, and the Romans and stuff. And, you know, he kind of like tells this like typical story that he's supposed to tell to appease the British people. But he constantly undercuts it and says, well, but really, you know, a place like Guyana has the best chance of doing something real because you actually have to give a shit about the world around you. Whereas us morons are off trying to kill ourselves with nuclear bombs. You know, like, this is the sort of gist of the speech he gives. So I think that's sort of, yeah, I think you're right. It's hard to think of somebody that does that, that he, you know, he takes it seriously, that people are interested and willing to learn. He doesn't have to like, you know, he doesn't have to dumb it down. It's like but he relates to people through this kind of like self-sabotage style, which also has a sense of him showing like, hey, you know, I was a poor kid who taught myself in a library. Like, I'm not going to pretend I'm somebody else. And also I'm not going to pretend that this stuff, you know, but also this stuff is important, right? Because you need to sort of understand it if you're going to really, you know, deal with anything politically. And I mean, I think he was prophetic in this veil of numbers stuff. I mean, with the post-genomic like biology papers that are just like bury you in data and say, look, yeah, you know, IQ is real or something. You know, I can't think of anybody who is producing text like Hogben would if he was alive now against that kind of stuff. Again, I hope I'm wrong. But I think the problem is that there's so much on the left where people just say, well, science is just, you know, bullshit, or science is just so politically, you know, bankrupt, like, fuck it, or we'll take the bits we like. And I think Hogben's approach is like, no, you have to just be able to tell the difference. And yeah, I mean, scientific literacy sounds so boring, but it's like really important. Yeah.
Thank you.
Are there further questions? Comments? Yes, Davor?
Sorry, can you hear me now? Yes. Huh?
Yeah, now it's fine.
Okay. Yeah, Ben, thank you for the interesting talk. I just wanted to add something, since I'm working in big history since a couple of years, and with archaeologists and cultural evolution theory people. I was very surprised when I entered the field, let's say like 12 years ago, that we are fully aware that we are constantly projecting current dispositions into the past. So, for example, when you take modern textbooks in archaeology, the first chapter will always be an overview how people in different sequences in time, projected their current situation, the current dispositives, and thinking back into the modeling of the past. I mean, at least in Europe. When you study archaeology today, then in the first or the second semester, you have a mandatory seminar about how does my society influence my work as an archaeologist. I mean, even when you go digging, even when we go just digging, not even concept making, not theory making or something like this, but literally only digging like an archaeologist, we even see influences of society there. So what I want to say is that the situation is not so dark currently, and the reason is not only that so deconstructivism and postcolonialism kind of spilled over into this field, but the reason is also internal in the field, because we saw that we're producing nonsense, and then we're looking to trying to understand why did we produce nonsense, in archaeology, and then we saw, okay, because we are projecting current dispositives, so to speak, back in time. So what I'm saying is that there are already so how should I say it? There are so it's happening already, definitely since a long time, that people are aware of that, and it also comes internally from the scientists themselves. You see, it's not only from philosophy from outside, and not only from social sciences. Just so you know, I mean, if you read the modern textbooks, they say that. But in Europe, it could be that the situation is different, of course, in America. Yeah.
Well, yeah, the examples I talked about, though, were, of course, popular books. So, of course, they don't have any of those warnings at all.
Exactly.
And of course, more people read those than a 2,000-page textbook or whatever.
Yes.
Which, I mean, but then, of course, there's, that may be the case, because there's some examples of, I've looked at some biology textbooks, which, I don't know about archaeology, but I just know in biology, there's very little comment about eugenics, for instance. Like if you take the top most popular biology textbooks in English, and I did this, there'll be either no mention of eugenics or racist biology, or there'll be like one paragraph of like an optional, homework lesson. That is, I think, part of the point that like Hogben and also Winter makes, is that, there's a tendency, at least in popular discourse, but also in some of the fields, that like ethical historical aspects can be bracketed out, right? And that they can be added on later, or like, if you take a special course just on that.
Yes.
And I think, that's part of, that's one part of the worry. And of course, the other part of the worry is the depth of the biases, right? Which is why so much of the decolonial work is saying, you can't just add diversity and stir, right? Like that's one of the critiques that people, especially in science and technology fields, will make, right? So it's always this question of, how much, how self-critical can you be, within Europe, if you don't actually speak to somebody who's First Nations, or you actually don't actually engage with them on a certain level, and that's going to differ field to field. I don't know about archaeology, but of course there, it obviously, maybe they have to, like you say, whereas in biology, they might not talk to anybody.
Okay. That's another thing I wanted to add. So the books you showed were, of course, popular science books about history, right? Harari, and I thank you very much that you called this book shit, because it's a big pile of nonsense. Harari's book, and the other one, Pinker also, yeah. Henrich is more like a scientist, but it's also like a more popular book. So what I also wanted to, so as I say, it's important to distinguish. The big history people are fully aware of all these things, of these projections, of cultural projections. One needs to distinguish between these popular books, which are more like I would call it Brahmanic science or something like this. You know, it's high priests. Pinker is a high priest of the liberal global order, teaching in Harvard. You know, he's not a scientist. He's basically a priest. And Harari is something similar, I think. So this projection of myths, or the production of myths, so to speak, right? One needs to distinguish between if this is really happening in the serious science and on the, you know, superficial popular level.
Yeah.
And just as you said, like in biology, which is a little bit further away from social thinking and social codes, again, is a different field, right, than as archaeology and so on. So one needs to distinguish a little bit between the fields and the
yeah.
yeah.
I mean, I think one problem with that, like I said, you know, because if people's conceptions of the status of a field are often going to be overdetermined by the popular accounts.
Yes.
Yeah. And like this is why, for instance, you know, like Peter Singer having his like Journal of Controversial Ideas, which is also a huge problem. That there's a lot of stuff that fits, for instance, racist models is getting published simply because it's considered heterodox. This has happened a lot in the last year, where so stuff that's considered, you know, alternative to like the dogma of political correctness or something will get accepted. So you almost have this problem too, whereas something seems like risque, it's and then this is in academic journals, right? Not popular works, but of course the popular works, you know, when people like Dawkins say eugenics isn't that bad on Twitter, you know, it has an effect, you know, in terms of what people consider the things scientists say, right? So, I mean, you're right, there's of course a distinction, but also the distinction gets awfully messed up very quick.
Yes. Yeah, I just wanted to defend the big history and the archaeologists and so on. We are not that bad. And let me just ask one funny question that you just inspired me to ask. Would it be possible to write a popular book in the direction of Sylvia Winter?
Yeah, I mean,
could you make a post-colonial populistic science book? Is this possible?
Yeah, I think things like that have been done. Yeah, I mean, there's stuff on like indigenous statistics, for instance. You know, books that address the sort of myths about Africa not having written language or like mathematics in a way, like this bullshit. Yeah, I mean, those exist. They exist. They've been done. Okay. You know, or I mean, Kimberly Tallbear has written stuff about you know, like the you know, how blood quanta, right, is in this, you know, supposed stuff, microbiology and stuff in archaeology being done on, you know, the bones of ancestors and right, what that means, you know. Yeah, I mean, I think it's totally possible. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, and yeah.
If there is no further last question, I think this is a good point to stop. It has been really interesting, the discussion as well as the lecture. Thanks to everybody. And thanks to Ben for your talk.
Thank you, Ben. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.